Well, if you have a Bible, turn to the book of Ruth, chapter 1. And today I did not put my bookmarks into their place, so I'm going to be turning more slowly to the passages I call out, but that's okay. We'll get to see if your pastor knows where the book of Ruth is. It's in the Bible. Oh, good. Book of Ruth, chapter 1. We are going to be looking at taking risks for God tonight. Yes, we're going to be looking at a wonderful theme. You know, risk-taking is something that isn't tied to age. You can take risks when you're 104, and you can take risks when you're a little kid. And the thing is, when we take risks in God, amazing things can happen. Now, there are different kinds of risks. There are different kinds of boldness required to face those situations. And I remember when I was a kid, one thing that I did was play tennis. You see, I mentioned a moment ago that my grandfather of 104 years passed away, but one thing about him is he was an avid tennis player. In fact, he played actively until he was 88. So he was big into tennis. He would win tournaments even in his old age because he loved to play and he was a great player. Now the problem is that sometimes when you have a legacy athlete in the family, the expectation is that everybody else is going to be good at that sport too. And somehow the tennis genes didn't reach me the same way. So I never won any tournaments or anything. I did play tennis as a family legacy thing, but I never excelled at it. I'll put it that way. But when I was a kid, even at a young age, I was taken to tennis situations, we'll say. There was playing tennis in the family context. Sometimes here and there were tennis lessons, but there was a tennis training thing that I was a part of when I was probably in elementary school. And one thing I remember from that time, really I remember one day in particular, there was a coach and he was training these kids how to play, and I was ready to go. But there was a kid that was a little bit older who was playing as well, and he developed a strategy that let him win every time. You see, when athletes get older, they have to switch up their game to become effective. But when you're kids, you can just keep repeating the same strategy again and again, and if the other kids don't understand what you're doing, you're just going to keep winning. And what this kid did is he would just run up to the net, and then, the other kids would kind of lob the ball over, and then he'd just smash it right down on their side, and nobody could return the shot. So we were all rotating, going through player after player, and he kept scoring on everybody, and nobody was willing to challenge this kid. Fortunately, I was one of the last kids in line, so I got to watch how all these other kids were losing, one after another, and it was basically a simple volley where the coach would just hit the ball over and, you'd do some back and forth and you'd see who would win that rally. Well, it was my turn to come up. All these other kids in front of me had lost. And he hit it over to that kid, and that kid, sure enough, first thing he did, he ran right up to the net. But here's the thing. I knew if I'd stay back on the baseline, I was going to get knocked out just like those other kids. So I grabbed my racket and I sprinted right up to the net. So as this kid's running towards the net, so am I running towards the net. And we're both running, and the kid hits the ball over, and I was right there to block it. Well, I hit it into the net too, but what can you do? I lost the point. But the coach, he was so excited. He said, yes! He said, finally, someone changed their game. And I don't know if I was 11 or something, I felt really important suddenly. I changed my game. I was doing a good job. But it's a little picture of life. Because sometimes, with different situations we face, maybe it's that the enemy keeps playing the same hand again and again and again, And maybe nobody in your family has ever challenged him on that front. Or maybe there's a situation in your community that just keeps happening again and again, and bad things keep taking place because nobody has confronted that situation or prayed into it or overcome in a way that changes circumstances. God loves people who are bold for him. He loves that boldness. But sometimes, if we're going to be bold, it involves taking risks. And that is what we're going to be looking at tonight. Just as an aside for the note takers, boldness isn't something that we can necessarily manufacture. It has to grow over time, that's one thing, but there's also something that gets imparted. Let me explain that a little bit. I don't want to get too far off here, but I think this is an important foundation for us. You see, part of the reason I was bold, not just in tennis, but in a lot of areas of life when I was a kid, was because there was such security in the home that I was growing up in. In fact, my parents would sometimes send me to ask other people questions, strangers, and they knew I would be bold enough to just go up to a perfect stranger at 5 or 6 years old and start talking to them and asking them questions. And sometimes I look back and I think, why was I so bold? Why was I willing to be so outgoing, even though I was maybe more introverted at times, but still very bold? I thought, why was that? Why was I willing to wrestle with some of the kids that were a head bigger than me? And sometimes I got kind of beat up too, but I was willing to do that because there was such a safety and such a security in the home. And there was such love there that I was able to operate in boldness in the outside world. Does that make sense? If you have a home base where you're really well fed, where you're really secure and established, you can be confident wherever you go. And later on, when our home situation went through some challenges, and I no longer felt the same kind of safety and the same kind of security and love as I did when I was a little kid because of some changes that took place in our house, all of a sudden, my boldness decreased. I was no longer as courageous as before. But isn't it just like God to fix broken situations? And it doesn't matter where we came from, what our background is, what our wounds are, God knows the perfect antidote and the perfect remedy. So if you grew up without any boldness at all, maybe you were the one who never wanted to speak out, maybe you were the one who shied away from any risk, that's okay, because God knows how to put courage in you, even if you've never felt it before. And like we said, when there's a home that's safe, there's a power that comes out of it. But similarly, when we walk with God and become secure in Him and who He's called us to be, suddenly out of that relationship, we can do mighty exploits. And tonight, we're going to be looking at several individuals in the Bible that took risks for God, and we're going to see how they dealt with situations and how they were victorious in those situations. Another way we could say it is, we're looking at some risky business tonight. But one axiom, if you want to call it that, in life, is that whenever a risk is taken, a confrontation occurs. There's always some confrontation that happens with risk, even if it's internal, because otherwise it wouldn't be a risk. If there isn't anything that you have to jump over to do it, you're not really taking a risk. So if you're thinking tonight, boy, I want to be effective for God, I want to be a wise risk taker for Him, you have to be willing to have confrontations. And the first person in the Bible we're going to look at that was willing to face a confrontation is a marvelous woman by the name of Ruth. Now, in Ruth chapter 1, we get the beginning of the story. Many of us are familiar with the account of Ruth. She was a Moabite woman. She married an Israelite who happened to be in the land of Moab, but this Israelite dies. And his brother dies too, and his father dies, and finally, Ruth is left with her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law says, look, I'm moving back to Israel. Everything here in this foreign land has gone bad for me. God's visiting Israel. I'm going back. God bless you, my daughters-in-law. And one of the daughters-in-law, Orpah, kisses her mother and weeps and leaves, but Ruth cleaves to her. Verse 16 of Ruth chapter 1. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. I have to pause there. We read passages too quickly. Did you catch that? Wherever you go, I will go. How many of you have ever said that to your mother-in-law? Wherever you go, I will go. I mean, think about that commitment. This is a lifelong commitment to a person that she's not married to. Wherever you will lodge, I will lodge. In other words, we're going to live in the same house. If any of you ever enjoyed having your own privacy or your own, family area, Ruth just gave that up for life. That's not a small thing. We can read those passages, oh yeah, wherever you go, I'll go, wherever you lodge, blah, 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 without realizing, wait a minute, she's just laying down some of the greatest comforts of her life. She is totally letting go of what the culture would say you should do. But it doesn't stop there. Your people shall be my people. She just released her whole nation. Everything she's ever known. Imagine if one day you just said, great, I'm moving to Tanzania, and I'm never coming back to the United States again. Your entire culture, your entire people, everything gone. Your people now will become my people. Wow. And then she says, and your God, my God. My entire culture, everything I've known, I'm laying down and I'm following you. That is no small risk. That is no small sacrifice. And culture runs so deep that we can often find it difficult to let go of, partially because we don't know anything else. I mean, think about it. If you were told, okay, today you're going to stop being American. Today you're going to stop living in your own house. Today you're going to stop worshiping the things that you've known. Everything's changing in one day. Not only would you say, wow, that's hard, but you'd also say, I don't know what to expect. I don't know what's coming because everything I've known is about to change. Ruth was a bold lady. But it's a picture for us. It's a picture for us tonight. Because the real question is, are you willing to let go of your culture? Are you willing to let go of your people? Are you willing to let go of the things you've worshiped? Are you willing to let go of your nation if God asks you to follow him in that way? Ruth was willing to do all of that for the sake of God. And God honored her tremendously. We know the story. Eventually, after all is said and done, David ends up being born as one of the descendants of Ruth. And even further down the line, Jesus is born from that same lineage, where God chose to put his own Messiah into the world through that genealogy as a descendant of Ruth, of a Moabitess, who let everything go to follow God. She took a risk. And actually, if you study the book of Ruth, there are multiple key times when she starts taking a risk. She ends up walking all the way from Moab to Israel. I don't know if any of you have ever walked from one country to another on foot, but it's a long walk. Not only that, then once she's there with Naomi, she takes another risk and says, okay, I'm going to start doing it the Israelite way. And if you read the law, one of the things it talks about is gleaning in the field. That was part of the law of Israel. And so Ruth goes out and gleans in the field. She's taking a chance. She's a foreigner. She's got no rights. She's got no protection. She's taking a risk. She submits it to her mother-in-law first, and her mother-in-law says, yep, go. And then things start to open up. She meets Boaz. Amazing things start happening. God starts blessing. God starts pouring out. But it all started by taking a risk for God. What could God do in your life if you were willing to risk your culture? Even if it's your favorite part of your culture, even if it's your most comfy moment lounging and watching the Super Bowl, I'm giving a random example, but whatever that part of your culture is, whatever it is, maybe it's a fun thing, but God's saying today, are you willing to give that to me? What can God do through a culture submitted to him? It's a risk, but it's a good one. Okay, Ruth was our first person. Our second person is Gideon. And for this one, note takers, you can find the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6, 7, 8. But we'll just go over some of the key elements, because Gideon, it wasn't so much that he took a risk regarding culture. For Gideon, he took a risk regarding fear. If we're not willing to confront fear, we probably will never take a risk, because there's always some element of fear that has to be overcome when we take a risk, especially for God. So what happened in the story of Gideon? Well, first of all, Gideon, as we know, was hiding when the Midianites were in the land, right? They were overcoming Israel. They were impoverishing Israel. They were coming against the people, and Gideon is threshing wheat in the winepress. He's hiding. And then the angel of the Lord meets him and tells him he's a mighty man of valor. And all of a sudden, Gideon is gripped with fear. In fact, once he realizes it's the angel of the Lord talking to him, he says, oh no, I'm going to die. He has to face fear regarding his own life. Have you ever confronted the fear in your life? Fear doesn't necessarily just disappear, by the way. Sometimes people can have fear sit there for months, years, or even decades. It can just sit there and keep robbing you, keep stealing from you, keep taking joy from you, keep limiting you in terms of where you're willing and able to go, until that fear is confronted. So Gideon starts by overcoming it personally. But what happens next? God speaks to him and says, Gideon, it's time. It's time, Gideon. You've got to take down the family idols. How many of you would volunteer for that role? Oh, yes, Lord. We've had strongholds for generations. I'm going to be the one to take them down. I'm going to be the one to... No. Gideon doesn't do it in the daytime. He does it at night. When no one's going to find out, he's going to try to sneak over there and take down the family strongholds. And he does it. He even takes a servant along. In fact, most things Gideon grabs someone else to help him out too. But that's allowed. We don't have to go through life alone. God lets us have friends and helpers to help us overcome in our weaknesses. But he had to confront personal fear. Now he's got to confront family fear and community fear at the same time, because he's dealing with idols of Baal, and as soon as those get cut down, the whole community comes and says, who did this? And when they find out it's Gideon, they say, oh, that guy's going to die. Talk about fear. I don't know if you've ever had your whole community come around you and say, we're going to kill you. But there would be some fear to overcome there. It's not a small risk to take. But if you look at this story, with each step that God takes Gideon through, he gets the victory over fear in his personal life. He gets the victory over fear and over the generational and family settings. And eventually, God is able to bring him to the place where he can take on the fear of the nation. All the people that have been hiding and oppressed by these Midianites, Gideon is willing, after going through some testing processes, to take his 300 men and take on over 100,000 Midianites and win. You might be thinking, that's great, Max. I don't plan on taking on the national fear. Okay, I understand. But have you overcome the personal fear? And by the way, only you are probably going to know in this room what those personal fears are. Because sometimes we're really bold and really strong in one area because we've already overcome fear there. But we might be a lot more shaky in another area. Maybe someone you know is just terrified of spiders. And you think, spiders, I stomp on them without looking. Ha 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 ha. And then someone says, that's wonderful. Do you want to do some public speaking? And you think, oh, no, not public speaking. Anything but that. Or maybe you're bold as a lion when it comes to witnessing, and you're like, I can lead 20 people to Christ. Amen. But if it comes to talking to family members, maybe that's the area where it's like, oh, no. I mean, I can witness to strangers, but I feel like if I speak to family members, I can't handle that rejection. It's different for different people. But if God's starting to highlight fear in your life today, whatever it might be, could be 1,000 different things. My question is, are you willing to take a risk? Are you willing to let God confront the very area that's been sitting there, maybe for years? Maybe it's been, well, I don't like to take it on head on, so I'll just kind of live around it. I'll just kind of move to this side or move to that side, but I don't want to take it on head on. Well, maybe tonight is your opportunity. And let me encourage you. With each step that Gideon took, he didn't take it without God. He took it with God. And so if you're feeling like you're confronting something that's bigger than you, ask God how to do it. And maybe he'll send some people along to help too. There's nothing wrong with that. But my point is, we don't overcome out of self-sufficiency or just willpower. We overcome through Jesus Christ. And as he helps us, that is where the victory comes. How many of you are familiar with the movie Miracle, the hockey movie? Yeah, okay, a few people. It's a sports movie, and it's one that Elena and I have enjoyed watching over the years. We haven't watched it recently, but it's a fun movie because there's one man who's willing to take on something that everybody else is afraid of. You see, the movie takes place in the late 70s and then into 1980 when the Soviets are the dominant force in ice hockey. The Soviets were winning again and again and again. They won the gold medal in 1964, in 1968, in 1972, in 1976. At each Olympics, they won, and by big margins. I mean, they were just destroying all the other teams. And so the U.S. Hockey Association was saying, what can we do? How can we stop these Soviets? They're so good at their game. And so even when the Soviet national team played against the NHL, I mean, they would be winning 10-1. I mean, it was just a total wash. But there was one man, Herb Brooks, who said, I can do it. I can do it. And at first people were laughing at him, and if you watch the movie, you'll see there were a lot of people that didn't believe and said, who are you to coach? And he had been a coach at the University of Minnesota, but he said, I know how we can take on this Soviet team and beat them. He said, everybody else has been so intimidated by these Soviet players. They're all, because of how aggressive the Soviets were, the other teams would just be playing defensively all the time. And he said, you don't defend them, you attack them. And you take their very game and you come against them with the same strategy and you put them on the defense. And what happened at the 1980 Lake Placid Olympics will go down in history. That was considered the miracle on ice, when the team of American amateurs, who were mostly college players, defeated the highly favored and perhaps best team in the world because they followed the dream of this coach who was willing to try something different, who was willing to take them on, and they won. They won. It was amazing, and they ended up winning the gold medal for the United States in those Olympics. When we take risks for God, sometimes it can feel like we're one person against a whole army. It can feel impossible. It can feel like we're completely outnumbered. But if we're willing to overcome fear, we already have the first step. We already have something that we're willing to get past if it shows up as a wall. So Ruth overcame a cultural barrier by following God and coming into the things of God and leaving the old culture behind. Gideon was willing to conquer fear, which ended up bringing a release not only in his own life, but to the larger nation. But sometimes we face enemies that aren't only fear. And the next person I'd like to highlight for us tonight is David. Now, many of us know the stories of David's overcoming. Again, for the note takers, 1 Samuel 17 is the famous chapter where David faces Goliath. But it's important to recognize scriptural principles because they don't just apply 3,000 years ago in the time of David. You see, David was confronting the enemy in his land. You might not be seeing a lot of Philistine giants walking around Northfield or walking around Minnesota or the United States, but there are other giants. There are other enemies. There are other things that need to be conquered in order for the nation to be set free. I'm talking about spiritual strongholds. I'm talking about what Paul refers to as not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, etc., in the heavenly places. And we know that. We're familiar with spiritual warfare. But the thing I want to point out about David is that he was fighting the enemy in his land. It was the jurisdiction that God had given to David. Let me ask you this question. What jurisdiction has God given you? What is the area that you're responsible for to God? And are there still enemies in that land? I don't want to get on too big of a tangent here because this is another study. I'm doing a personal study right now on shepherding. And I'm going through the whole Bible and all the different instances where shepherds are mentioned and what God says about shepherds and what their responsibilities are. It's fascinating. I'm loving that study. And maybe that'll turn into a sermon or sermon series one day. But one of the things that really amazed me is, especially looking at the role of shepherding in Ezekiel, one of the key aspects of what God loves to see in a shepherd is the shepherd destroys the enemies in his sphere so that the sheep and the flock can flourish. I thought, how amazing. But that's exactly what David did. Before he fought Goliath, he dealt with the lion and he dealt with the bear. And as he overcame those areas, and at that point, that was his job, by the way. He was working the family business. He was taking care of his father's flock. And maybe at your job, there are strongholds that are keeping everyone else from succeeding. And maybe the other people at your workplace don't know what those strongholds are. They might be oblivious to them. But are you willing to take a risk for God? Are you willing to say, God, if you show me how to overcome some of the spiritual strongholds at my workplace, I'm willing to be used by you in that area so that everybody else at my office or in my company or whatever the context might be can flourish. Think about it. With David, it started at work. Then it moved on to facing Goliath and defeating him. But eventually, after David comes into kingship, he's dealing with enemies all over the place. He's not just fighting the enemies within Israel, but he's actually expanding the borders. All of a sudden, Israel starts to grow. The empire goes beyond Damascus. It goes beyond Edom. It goes beyond all these neighboring nations that had been oppressing Israel. The whole nation expands because David has learned principles of taking risks and overcoming the enemy. And Israel reached its peak, its height, during the reigns of David and Solomon. Because of that, God made a way. Are you willing to confront the enemy in your life? Well, you might be saying, okay, this is great. I appreciate the idea of changing cultures. Okay, I understand. As I follow God, some of my culture might change because God's culture will come to me and I'll make adjustments. Okay, I can see the idea of overcoming fear because if I don't do that, I can't really move on to anything else because fear always tries to contain and constrain us. And maybe you can see, all right, there are strongholds in the land. There are things around me that need to be overcome. I'm willing to be used to do those things, but my question is, how can I do that? How can I, little me, be used by God for that purpose? Well, that brings us to our fourth person, and that's Moses. Particularly In the 3rd chapter of Exodus, when Moses is at the burning bush, God calls him to bigger things. But with Moses, the risk that he has to take, the thing that he confronts is identity. Because God says, Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh and to deliver my people. And Moses' first response is, who am I? Who am I that I should speak to Pharaoh? Who am I? And maybe that's a question you ask yourself a lot. God, who am I? Please send Reinhard Bonnke over there. He's really good at that. Or Lord, please have Bill Johnson preach that message. He's really good at that. Or God, maybe have my older brother do that thing. He's really good at this. Or maybe anybody else. Who am I? Moses had to confront his identity, his personal inabilities. Remember, he said, Lord, I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. I can't even talk right. You got the wrong guy. What is it for you? I'm not fast enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not skilled enough. I'm not educated enough. I'm not wise enough. I don't have enough experience. I'm not a man. I'm not a woman. I'm not a this. I'm not a that. Whatever. I'm too old. I'm too young. But God's response is, who made man's mouth? Was it not I? If you're able to overcome and take a risk in the area of identity, it will begin to allow God to change how you see yourself. And once that starts to happen, you'll find that you become a much greater risk taker for God because you no longer focus on your inabilities or who you used to be. You can start focusing on who God is through you. And God does all those things in Moses. You see, Moses first says, who am I? But then he says, God, who are you? If the Israelites ask me, who sent you to us, what should I tell them? And that's when God reveals more of himself. He reveals his name. I am that I am. That's my name. That's who's sending you to the Israelites and to Pharaoh. Are you willing to confront your identity? Your personal identity, your identity related to God, and then your identity related to others. This is one we skip sometimes. Sometimes you can be bold as a lion in your prayer closet, but then when it's time to interact with others about some of those same things, you can feel intimidated. And in Moses' case, well, we can understand, Pharaoh in the past had sought to kill him. So he had fled to Midian. For 40 years, he lived with an identity crisis. Maybe you need an old identity resurrected in you. Maybe there have been some dreams in you, some things that you knew God had called you to at one time that have fallen by the wayside, that God is bringing back. Maybe you need to be willing to let God speak through you boldly, even if it offends some other people. One person that was also a great example more recently than 3,500 years ago of the same principle was a Welsh man by the name of Evan Roberts. And many of you have heard the name Evan Roberts before. He was known in the Welsh revival of the early 1900s. But the thing that probably stands out to me about Evan Roberts more than anyone else, I mean, he was a young man, metal worker, coal miner, didn't have much going for him. Certainly not someone you would expect to lead a movement that would cause over 100,000 people to give their lives to Christ. But the thing that Evan Roberts had was he had an active prayer life. And one of the biggest prayers that he's known for having prayed again and again is, God, bend me. And others were saying, God, bend Wales. God, bend the world. God, change us. Change the nation. Change the circumstances. And that's usually what we want to pray. We look at the world around us and we say, God, I don't like the way my country is right now. God, I don't like the way the world is right now. God, change these things. But Evan Roberts started by saying, God, bend me. Bend me for Jesus Christ's sake. Are you willing to have your identity so changed, so transformed, that you don't even recognize yourself anymore? That you don't see yourself through the old lenses anymore, through the old failures, through who you used to be? Are you willing to confront your identity in God that way? If God could do it through a simple man and lead over 100,000 people to Christ, what can he do through you if you're willing to take a risk with him and confront your identity? The final person I want us to look at is Joshua. Joshua is one that I love because Joshua, you can see the growth process really laid out clearly. Some of the other people in the Bible, you see a little bit of their origin, their beginnings, and then all of a sudden you see when they're really walking big with God. But with Joshua, there are lots of stages, lots of steps where he's waiting on Moses. He's fighting some battles, but he's still not in charge. But he's waiting on the Lord. He's spending time with God. And eventually, God promotes him to where he's leading the nation. We've talked about taking risks for God. Here's one that we often don't think of. Are you willing to confront your faith? See, we're willing to confront all those things that seem bad, like fear and strongholds and enemies. But are we willing to confront our faith? Where we say, my faith right now is in these categories, or it's limited like this, but are you willing to stretch your relationship with God past where it's gone before? Now, please don't misunderstand me. I know it's God who's in charge of the relationship, okay? I'm not talking about performance. I'm talking about, are we willing to take a risk with him? Because God is so much more willing to act than I think we are to ask. Smith Wigglesworth said that first, by the way, so I didn't come up with that. But Joshua got to a point where he had to confront his faith after walking in the shadow of Moses. And then God gave him promises to suddenly, Joshua, it's you. You're going to take the land. And Joshua has to go, wow, do I believe God enough to take these steps to lead this entire nation into the promised land? But he does. And then, do I have faith for us to overcome the enemy? Do I have faith to believe, God, that the Jordan is going to be dried up as we go and pass over on dry land? Do I have faith to see the walls of Jericho come toppling down? Do I have faith again and again and again? But by the time you get to Joshua chapter 10, something different happens. It's no longer just God giving Joshua a command and Joshua believing. Joshua starts pushing the envelope. He starts pushing the boundaries of his faith with God to where he recognizes, God's sending me on this mission to fight these enemies. I'm in a battle, but I know that my God is for us. He's promised it all along. He's called us to it all along. I'm going to stretch my faith beyond where it's ever gone before. And he says, sun, stand still, and moon, stand still. And it says in Joshua 10, well, actually, let's turn there. That's too good to just kind of reference. We've got to we've got to look at Joshua 10 here because it's such a powerful moment. Joshua 10, verse 12. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, sun stands still over Gibeon and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still. How many of you have ever told the sun to stand still and had it obey you? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And this is verse 14, and this is what I want us to catch. And there has been no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man. For the Lord fought for Israel. He heeded the voice of a man. What does that mean? God answered many prayers throughout the Bible. What does he mean? He heeded the voice of a man. It meant God had a created order. He created the whole universe. He set it in motion. He set up the laws of nature, everything in a certain way. And here's Joshua speaking something different than how God has set up the entire structure, and God conforms all of creation to what Joshua says. He heeded the voice of a man. Wow. It's such a picture of Jesus Christ, because when Jesus cries out on the cross, all of creation changes again, where suddenly everything that happened up until that point in time was one way. Everybody died. Nobody came to be with God in the way that we have access to now through Jesus. We know there were a couple of people that didn't die in the normal way, like Elijah going up to heaven and all that. But Jesus changed life for us. Jesus changed the way things were done. Are you willing to take a risk with God that confronts your faith to where you're pushing the envelope? It might not be in a battle against enemies with the sun and the moon standing still. But how many impossible situations are there in your life where you recognize, you know what? My faith might not be there to move that yet. But God, help me to stretch the envelope, to move into a new dimension of relationship with you, to where what I know can change in you. I don't think we're going to do any closing music tonight. We'll just keep it simple. I want us to be challenged, though. I don't want this just to feel like, oh, that's a fun Bible story, because people can be used by God like this today. One man that comes to mind is Lauren Cunningham, and we'll wrap up with this story. Lauren Cunningham was a man ordained by the Assemblies of God, doing the right thing, but in 1956, God gave him a vision. He was in the Bahamas. He was following God, but God showed him a vision of these waves that started washing over the coast, over the shoreline. And then these waves started going out further and further, and they started going out to countries and nations and continents. He saw these waves, and these waves turned into young people. And these waves went out into the nations and transformed nations. He had a vision from God. And yet, when he brought it to the Assemblies of God, and I'm not against the Assemblies of God, I like the Assemblies, but at that time, the leadership of the Assembly said, no, this doesn't make sense, that's not going to work. there's too much risk involved sending young people to nations. I mean, that's preposterous. They're not even trained. What's going to happen? But in 1956, that vision was born, and that became, in a way, the beginning of YWAM. And for those of you who know YWAM, they've sent out thousands and thousands and thousands of people. In fact, some of the statistics I was reading about said that this was a few years ago now, but that they trained up about 25,000 people annually that they send out on short-term missions. And then apart from those short-termers that get sent out, they had something like 11,000 staff members internationally by the early 2000s. Wow. Every part of the world covered by these young people going out and sharing the gospel. But it came from one man stretching the envelope. And here's the thing, guys. As you grow in faith, there might be times when others say, we can't walk with you in this. We don't believe for the same things. And that's okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be that God will hook you up with special people that aren't in your circle right now, but that He'll bring others to walk out some of the visions He gives you. But my point is, there are risks we can take in many different areas. We don't want those risks to come out of our own flesh. We don't want it to come out of the wrong place. But if we're willing to walk with God, are we willing to confront some things in our lives, in our jobs, in our communities, in our country? What risk are you willing to take for God today? Let's pray. God, we are so excited to walk with you. We are so excited that you're stretching us beyond what we know and beyond where we've gone before. But God, I pray tonight, fill us with fresh faith. And Lord, let each of us become a risk taker for the kingdom of God and for Jesus Christ. In your great name, amen.